Memorial Day. We have great holidays like Veterans Day, Armistice Day. And it's time that we educate our young people about freedom, because they don't know what it costs. They've never had to pay. They don't know what it took for us to be able to stand here this morning as free people. We're going to look at that in Matthew 27, starting at verse 45. Jesus had been on his 3-year ministry to the Jewish people. He had grown up a young man under authority. He had learned a trade. He was a carpenter. We don't really know what kind of carpenter he was. He probably was good at stone laying. There's lots of rocks around Israel, lots of limestone. They didn't have a lot of wood, but they had a lot of rocks. Many of the houses were built out of stone, and many of them only had wood on the roofs, where they actually didn't even have shingles, but they would build a roof and make it out of thatch and put dirt on top of it, and it might have had a foot or foot and a half of dirt on top of the house, and many times that's where they grew their flowers. And the houses were constructed that way. Jesus probably would have been an expert at either building houses or making furniture or something of that sort. And so we know Jesus grew up in Israel as a Jew. But when he was 30 years old, he went into ministry, and he preached throughout the land. He condemned religion for what it was. He taught grace. But at the 3rd year of his ministry, he realized that the Jewish people as a whole would have rejected him as Messiah. Even though he performed many miracles, he served them as a servant would, not as a king. And he recognized that he would not set up his millennial reign at that time. It says that Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. He saw his land in rejection of Bible doctrine, and he wept. And today, as we look at our nation and we see the negative volition that permeates our people, it is right to have something inside of your soul that is hurting for our nation. We're hurting on the inside because people are rejecting biblical truth. We're hurting to see our once great nation go down, and we need revival. We need people to pick their Bibles back up and begin to look for answers. And as God's people, we need to be ready to have answers. And not only that, others need to be able to look to us and say, that's the kind of life that I would like to have. That's the kind of power I would like to have in my life. That's the kind of dynamics I would like to have in my life. And so Jesus saw his nation and he wept. But Jesus continued on with God the Father's plan for his life. And as it were, at the end of his ministry, he had his disciples, and he took them into the Garden of Gethsemane. He began to pray. And he prayed, and his disciples went to sleep. And he prayed all night with such fervency that his sweat turned to blood, because he knew of the horror that was about to come. And so early in the morning, Jesus was arrested. He was arrested by religion. He was treated as a criminal. He was chained. He was taken through 6 different trials, all of which were corrupted. most of which were illegal. He was beaten by the Sanhedrin, which were 70 men who struck him in the face, to the point that he would not be recognizable. He was impaled with a crown of thorns upon his head and beaten with a rod and mocked as the King of the Jews. They hung over him a royal garment as they struck him and taunted him, saying, "This is the King of the Jews." Jesus was whipped with a cat of 9 tails. His back would have been lacerated to the point of all of his flesh being stripped from his back. And he never cried out one time. He never said, "God, take these people away. They don't deserve what they're getting." And finally, Jesus drug his cross outside the city, across those crushed limestone streets. The dust and the grit would have been sticking to the blood on his body. It was a dirty job. But he was thinking of us. He was thinking of you. He was thinking of bringing you into his kingdom. He was thinking of sharing his glory with you for all of eternity. And that's what kept him going. And so as Jesus went up the hill, the place of the skull, the hill of Golgotha, we call it Calvary's Hill because that's where he won the ultimate victory. They laid him down on a cross and drove the nails through his hands and drove the nails through his feet. And he cried out, not in anguish, not in pain, but he prayed for those with the hammers in their hands, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." They dropped Jesus' cross into a hill, into a hole there on top of that hill, and Jesus hung between heaven and earth as the Lamb of God. He was actually crucified at 9 a.m. in the morning, and he hung there for 3 hours. He gave a testimony to the thief who had believed in him. He said, "Today you shall be with me in paradise." Even though this thief had never been baptized or joined a church, or walked an aisle, or prayed the sinner's prayer, or had a witness or a testimony, this man had salvation because he believed in the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And so we see in verse 45 the crucifixion, and it says, "Now from the 6th hour," that would have been noon, "until the ninth hour," that would be 3 in the afternoon, "there was darkness," scotizo in the Greek, not just a cloudiness, not just a gloominess. It was a darkness that permeated the land. Why would there be darkness on this day? This is the first miracle of the cross. God had to shroud that hill in darkness because what was about to happen was so terrible that it could not be looked upon. You may think of bad things that have happened to man throughout human history, but the spiritual death that Christ died was the worst thing that had ever happened to any one man in all of human history. And so there was darkness as God the Father convened the supreme court of heaven on top of that hill of Golgotha. He shrouded it in darkness darkness over all the land, that is the land of Israel. Verse 46, and about in the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. The Greek tense in this phrase says that he kept on crying out. He actually says he shrieked under the pain of spiritual death. Jesus became sin for us on that day. And you may ask yourself, where did my sin go? What about those sins? They went to Christ. Your past sins and sins that you have not even committed yet. They were poured out on Christ and judged on that day. And what were the effects of that sin? God the Father could not even look at His only begotten Son as He became sin. He had to turn His back. And that caused spiritual death. And Jesus, being separated from the Father and having become sin and being judged for those sins in His body on the tree, He cried out under the pain and agony of spiritual death, my God, why have you forsaken me? In verse 47, it says, some of those who stood there, when they heard that, said, this man is calling for Elijah. Immediately, one of them ran and took a sponge and filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and offered him to drink. The rest said, let him alone. Let us see if Elijah will come to save him. Little did they know that Jesus would not accept any saving work. He would stay on that cross for you and I. In verse 50, we see after Jesus had finished His work of purchasing each one of our souls out of the slave market of sin, Jesus cried out again, and it means with a loud voice. We understand from John that Jesus cried out, tetelestai. It means finished. The work of salvation was completed. It's in the Greek tense. That means it's completed in the past, and the results of it continue forever. That means you can't work for your salvation. Jesus did it all. And so He cried out with a loud voice and yielded up His spirit. He said, Father, into Thy hands I commend my spirit. Then we see the next miracle. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And the third miracle, the earth quaked and the rocks were split. And the fourth miracle, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. That means they were resuscitated. And coming out of the graves after His resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. These people were resuscitated to share the good news about Jesus, His death, burial, and resurrection. Now in verse 54, so that when the centurion, this is the man in charge of the crucifixion. I come all this way to get to this one man right here. This is a centurion. This would have been an officer of the Roman army. This man would have literally crucified thousands of people. He would have overseen the crucifixion of thousands and probably tens of thousands of people. An officer in the Roman army is paid to evaluate. He is paid to take an overall look at the situation and take all of the facts and be able to work logically in his mind to fix the problem. That's what the Roman military was there for. And it is obvious that this man had been involved in many crucifixions, but he had never seen one like this. He'd never seen one like this. He looked and he saw that darkness had fallen across the land at noon. And this was very odd. I'm going to tell you, last night we saw a moon. And as it rose up into the horizon, it was red. It was blood red. After Jesus was crucified at the Pentecost, there was a blood moon. Now, we didn't actually have a blood moon last night. Our moon was red last night because of the atmospheric conditions are dirty, and you have all of the emissions and things like that are in the air low on the horizon that you're looking through. But it was a sign of the cross, the blood moon. This man saw the darkness across the land. He realized this is not normal. This is not logical. I have crucified thousands of men. I've never seen one where it turned dark in the middle of the daytime. He went on and he said, I've crucified thousands, and not one have I seen die by their own accord. Jesus commanded his own soul to be removed from his body. See, normally in crucifixion they had to break their legs so that they would suffocate and die. And Jesus, when he died, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. He gave up the ghost and he died. Immediately, a huge earthquake happened, such a magnitude of an earthquake that rock split in two. This centurion is viewing these things. He had never viewed anyone who took the nails like Jesus did. Somebody who drove nails through your hands, they could look at you like thousands of others, and they would know that you would have some cursing for them. You would be very aggravated with them. And Jesus looked at these Roman military men, and he looked them right in the face as they drove the nails in his hand. And he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He viewed this and he said, this is not logical. This does not make sense. And he viewed these great miracles, and he says in verse 54, so when the centurion, who was paid to think logically, and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the other miracles that happened that day, they feared greatly. They had respect. They knew God was in it. They had been convicted about the truth that had happened that day. They feared greatly, saying, truly this was the Son of God. And this great military man was able to view the cross. And he didn't have the fog of religion over his eyes. He didn't have the scar tissue in his soul that religion brings. He was able to view this logically and come up with a conclusion that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And he was a born-again believer on that hill. One of only 3 people who were born again on the day of Jesus' crucifixion. Now, this brings us to Memorial Day. You may say, well, how did you get Memorial Day out of that? Let's work on it. This man was in the military. We get our freedom through military victory. It's given by God, but it's maintained through military victory. We're going to make some analogies here. Things that are true about the soldier. The first thing that is true about soldiering is that the location is normally in a foreign land. Our policemen and women police our nation inside our borders. That's how they're supposed to be used to catch criminals. Our military is supposed to be used outside of our land to search out and destroy the enemies on their soil before they bring the fight home. And so they're always in a foreign location. They're always out in the field. Our military men and women, many of them are sleeping in a ditch, in a dirt hole in Afghanistan or Iraq right now, while we sleep in our beds. And even our policemen and women get to sleep in their own beds most of the time. So that's what's different about the military, their location. They're always away from home. Guess what? Jesus Christ was away from home on his mission here to earth. He set down his royal crown there beside his throne in heaven. He took off his royal robe and he set it to the side and he said, I'm going to be born the King of the Jews. And you know, he went to a 5-star hotel to be born. Didn't he? No, he didn't. He went to the barn. He was laid in the manger in the feed trough. And so his location was away from home. This makes the soldier like Christ. Can you see that? The soldier's away from home. Jesus is away from home. They do their jobs away. The pay. You ever thought about what it pays to be an infantryman, to carry a rifle all over the earth? My wife's grandfather carried a rifle across Europe. They marched across Europe and they freed people from tyranny. They fought and they killed men on the other side. They freed them from a dictatorship, a ruler. His pay was little. Many of them paid with their lives. How much do you think your life is worth if you had to get it in a check? Not, you can't come up with a number, can you? Because you can't put a price on a soul. So the soldier, he agrees to go into battle. And it's not to pay. He is fighting for your freedom. Yours. Can you hear me? Your freedom. So you can be free. So you don't have to be a slave. Not for the pay. Jesus Christ paid it all. Can you put a price on his death? No. Can you ask God the Father how much he gave on that day? No, he gave it all. He gave his only begotten Son. And this Memorial Day, see what we're doing here, we're drawing a conclusion that the soldier is more like Christ than any other occupation that you can have, because you give it all for very little. Today's fighting man is held in view of contempt. You mean you would actually take a rifle and you would kill someone? See your response to that. Sir, that is my duty, to kill the enemy so that he might not kill you. This view is held in contempt today. Oh, we need to be nice. We need to wave white flags of surrender. We need to try to talk them out of being mean. We need to try to do some psychotherapy with them to try to convince them that they don't need to kill Americans. That's what our modern day thought of the soldier ought to be. We ought to be just there, over there just to get shot up. And if you were to fight back against anything, you would be held in view of contempt. Jesus Christ was held in contempt. He was viewed as, in the religious realm, he was viewed as the lowest of the low. When he turned over the money changers' tables in the temple, he was held in contempt. Ingratitude. There are many people this weekend who believe that Memorial Day weekend is about a hot dog, about cooking out, about being able to hang out at the lake, about hanging with friends, about having a longer weekend than normal, and they have no idea the blood of the men and women who was shed abroad, whether it be in Vietnam, Korea, France, wherever our men have went and fought and died on a battlefield. Our young people have ingratitude, and it's because we have not taught them. And if they were called on today to do what the generations past have done, they would say, no, thank you. Because they don't know the value of freedom. Jesus' work on the cross is held in contempt. It's held in ingratitude by the religious who are working to get saved and working to stay saved. They believe that that's not all you need. They say you need a little more than Jesus' work on the cross. You've got to be good. You've got to stick with it. And they hold Jesus with ingratitude. Today we see abuse of the freedom that has been given. Now, if you were to, Preston, if you were to look at your great-grandfather that carried a rifle across Europe, fighting for your freedom so that you might not be a slave, and if he were to come back from the dead today and ask you, Preston, what are you going to do with your life now that you're a free American? You see how that would change things? You see, you wouldn't just say, well, I just want to have fun. That's an abuse of freedom. You take your freedom that has been given to you that was so valuable and so costly. You see that? It cost a lot to be free. And you do something with it that is good. You make something out of your life. You take that freedom that is so valuable and you use it. And today we see the abuse of freedom. So much freedom and so little people taking advantage of it. And today we have the abuse of what Christ did, the abuse of church. Churches have now turned into program churches. They're no longer teaching doctrine categorically. They're no longer emphasizing spiritual growth to maturity. And it is now about more religion than anything. And so we abuse the freedom that Christ gave. He set us free from spiritual death. He set us free from legalism and religion. And so what I want to do finally is I want to put right down here the order of the day, the thought of this weekend for you ought to be respect. First of all, as a Christian, you ought to respect what Jesus did for you on the cross. You ought to have the utmost respect for the man that purchased your salvation. He sacrificed it all so that we could have eternal life. And we ought to be able to look to the cross and salute Jesus Christ for what He's done. But also this weekend, as Memorial Day weekend, we ought to be able to look to those soldiers who have fought and died. And we ought to have the utmost respect for what they have given. They have given it all. And that is what Memorial Day is about. We'll stop right there and take a break.